George, sitting at his imposing mahogany desk, looked at the screens in front of him. Performance charts, figures, profits, everything he had always valued. His fingers drummed impatiently on the arm of his chair. Another business meeting was about to begin, and he already knew the focus: cutting costs, optimizing the workforce. He had no time for sentimentality. The HR team entered the room with a dossier of employees in their hands. Among them, Margaret's name shone at the top of the list. George flipped through the document quickly and coolly, barely paying attention to the faces and stories behind each name. Margaret Davis began, the head of HR, 63 years old, 30 with the company. Dedicated, never missed a day's work. But with the pace we're setting now, her performance has dropped. George leaned forward, his eyes cold and calculating. Is she slowing down progress? The woman hesitated for a moment, aware of the impact of the next words. She can no longer keep up with the workflow as she used to. It's not a question of competence, but age takes its toll. George shook his head, emotionless. We're in a competitive market. We can't afford to keep someone who can't keep up. He looked directly at the head of HR. Do whatever it takes. Later that day, Margaret was called into the manager's office, her heart already anticipating what was to come. Over the years, she had seen many familiar faces come and go. She knew her turn was coming, but she hadn't expected the end to come so abruptly. As she entered the room, she met George. Although she had worked for the company most of her life, this was one of the few times she had seen him up close. He seemed distant, untouchable, like someone who lived in a world where emotions were insignificant. Margaret, began George, his voice low, without a trace of empathy, you've been a loyal employee for many years, but we're restructuring, and we need people who can handle the current pace of the company. Margaret felt a lump in her throat. I can still be useful. I know I'm not as fast anymore, but my experience, doesn't that count? George crossed his arms without looking away. Experience is important, but it's not enough. We need agility. The demands are changing. It's best for the future of the company. The pain was evident in Margaret's eyes, but she didn't let her tears fall. She lifted her chin, trying to steady herself. I've worked here almost half my life. I've never failed, never disappointed. And now I'm just dismissed? George sighed, already tired of the conversation. It's not personal, Margaret. It's just business. The sentence hung in the air like a final blow. She knew that arguing would do no good. She stood up with dignity, picking up her bag and straightening her coat with trembling hands. Thank you for the years I've been given here, she said in a broken voice, before turning to leave the room. George, already immersed in his papers, didn't reply. For him, it was just another difficult decision that needed to be made. Margaret, on the other hand, was leaving behind 30 years of dedication, feeling as if her whole life had been wiped away with a single signature. As she left the company for the last time, Margaret looked at the huge building where so many of her days had been spent. The cold afternoon wind was blowing in her face, but she didn't allow herself to weaken there. She knew the outside world wasn't easy for someone her age, but at least her dignity still belonged to her. As she walked through the busy streets, she felt a mixture of fear and hope. Something inside her told her that this abrupt end might actually be a new beginning. Inside the office, George had already forgotten about the meeting. His mind was on the numbers, on the company's next steps. He didn't think about the stories behind each decision he made, just the end result. Margaret, now outside, was already thinking about her next steps. The world seemed big and scary, but inside her there was a flame that, however dim, still burned, and she was determined to keep it burning, no matter what. Margaret arrived home, her mind still reeling from her dismissal. Her small apartment seemed larger than usual, too quiet. The walls bore memories of years of hard work, of early mornings when she came home late, exhausted but proud of her efforts. Now, without a job, the space seemed to suffocate her. She sat at the kitchen table where an aged wooden box rested in the corner. This was where she kept her soap-making materials, a hobby she had maintained over the years. It was always something she did to relieve stress, to disconnect from her routine. With her eyes fixed on the box, an idea began to germinate. I can do this again. More than a hobby, she murmured to herself, sliding her fingers across the tabletop. The idea comforted her, but insecurity soon took over. Will anyone buy it? What if I'm not good enough? Life had changed so quickly that she felt like she was treading on unfamiliar ground. However, the memory of her grandmother, who had taught her the art of soap making when she was still young, brought a shy smile to her face. Slowly, she opened the wooden box. The familiar smell of essential oils and materials awoke something dormant inside her. Margaret took out an old bar of soap she had made years ago. The scent of lavender and honey filled the kitchen, and for a brief moment, she forgot the weight of her dismissal. It was like coming home to something that had always brought her peace. Maybe I should give it a try, she thought aloud, as she organized the ingredients on the kitchen worktop. The idea of creating something with her own hands, of having control over her future again, gave her a breath of hope. It was a chance to start again, even if it seemed risky. That evening, Margaret made her first batch of soap. Her hands, once used to recording sales notes and organizing shelves, now carefully shaped each bar, like a sculptor bringing back a part of herself. The mixture of oils, colors, and fragrances filled the air of the small kitchen. "Let's see how this turns out," she said, gazing at the result of her work with a look of determination. Over the next few days, Margaret began researching local markets where she could sell her creations. She signed up for neighborhood fairs and, for the first time in many years, felt an excitement she hadn't felt since her first days working for the supermarket chain. When the day of her first fair arrived, Margaret was nervous, but also excited. Her small stand was neatly organized, soaps of different scents, colors, and sizes, all handmade and carefully packaged. She had invested her savings in simple but elegant packaging and small handwritten labels. She was proud of each piece, knowing that it was her story, her rebirth. As the hours passed, people began to stop by her stand, curious about the products. One woman approached, picked up a bar of lavender soap, and smiled. "This is wonderful. Do you make these soaps yourself?" the customer asked, looking delighted. Margaret, surprised by the compliment, smiled back. "Yes, I make them myself. I use natural ingredients. I learned from my grandmother many years ago." The woman sniffed the bar once more and put it in the trolley. "I'll take 2, one for me and one for my mother. She'll love it." Margaret handed over the soaps, feeling her heart warm. It was her first sale, and as simple as it was, it meant much more than just money. It was a step towards a new life, something she never imagined would happen. By the end of the fair, Margaret had sold most of her products. But more than that, she had rediscovered something within herself, a sense of self-sufficiency and creation that she had lost over the years. For the first time in a long time, she felt in control. When she returned home that evening, exhausted but content, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at the wooden box again. Now it was not just a reminder of an old hobby, but the symbol of a new beginning. Margaret knew it wouldn't be easy. Making a living from her creations would require time, effort, and a dedication that she might not have had at first. But she also knew that she could no longer depend on others to define her worth. "This is going to be my journey," she said quietly, looking at the remaining bars of soap. "I'm going to make it work." With each passing day, Margaret found more strength in her new life. Each bar of soap she sold represented more than just a product. It was a declaration that she still had a lot to offer, that her value could not be measured by how quickly she stacked goods in a supermarket. George's days after the accident were long and lonely. He would wake up in a hospital bed, his legs immobilized and his body scarred by the consequences of the crash. His tired eyes roamed the cold, empty room, a routine that seemed endless. George, who had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency, now depended on nurses and doctors for the simplest tasks. It ate him up inside. "Mr. George, time for your medicine," said a nurse as she entered the room. She fluffed the pillows while he took his pills in silence, without even looking at her. The weeks turned into months. George had to relearn to walk, to trust his legs again. The once imposing and rigid body was now more fragile, a shadow of the confident man he had always been. Every step, every little bit of progress was accompanied by pain, not just physical, but emotional. Loneliness was his constant companion. With rehabilitation came isolation. His work colleagues, who used to come to him constantly for meetings and important decisions, were now limited to brief formal messages. phone calls from his team became increasingly sparse, and George realized that, in the business world, his absence wasn't felt as much as he had imagined. "I need to get back to work," he told his physiotherapist one day, the frustration evident in his voice. "I can't stand still like this." The physiotherapist, a middle-aged man with a calm expression, looked at him and shook his head. "Your body isn't ready yet, George. It takes time. You need to be patient." "Time is something I can't waste," George replied, his teeth clenched. However, fate seemed to have other plans for him. Even after months of recovery, he still wasn't strong enough to return to his old routine. The business that had once been his absolute priority now seemed distant. He felt powerless, something he had never experienced in such a raw way. One day, as he looked out of the hospital window, watching life go on without him, George felt a deep unease. He, who had always been in control of everything and everyone, was now a spectator of his own life. He had never experienced such fragility. And for the first time, he began to reflect on his actions, his decisions in the past, and how everything he had always cherished seemed insignificant at that moment. "Who am I without my job?" he muttered to himself, his voice filled with despair. Without an answer, silence crept into the room, and the loneliness continued to eat away at him. The following days were marked by constant reflection, something he had avoided for many years. George had always been practical, objective, rarely thinking about the impact of his decisions beyond the numbers. But now, trapped in that room, all he had were thoughts, memories, and the constant feeling of emptiness. When he was finally discharged, George was no longer the same man. The accident had changed him in ways he still didn't fully understand. Returning to his old life seemed daunting. He knew he needed to reconnect with the world, but he didn't know how. "You're cleared to go home, but you still need a lot of physiotherapy," the doctor informed him as George signed the discharge papers. He didn't reply, just nodded, lost in his own thoughts. On returning home, George felt like a stranger in a space that had once been familiar. The luxury apartment with windows overlooking the city seemed emptier than ever. Every room reminded him of the life he had built, a life of material achievements, but now it seemed purposeless. He walked through the corridors unhurriedly, feeling the loneliness echoing off the walls. A few days later, still trying to adjust to his new reality, George decided to take a walk around the city. He wanted to escape the isolation for a while, to feel the world around him again. While driving slowly, he passed a sign advertising a local fair with handicrafts and products from small producers. An unexpected curiosity overtook him. "Why not?" he muttered to himself, turning the car around and heading towards the market. Perhaps in that simple place, far removed from his corporate life, he could find some meaning. When he arrived, he parked the car and walked slowly between the stalls, observing the people. There was a simplicity to the atmosphere that he hadn't seen for a long time. The smell of food, the sound of laughter, and the murmur of conversations filled the air. It was a welcome distraction from his solitary routine. As he passed several stalls, one caught his eye. It was small, with handmade soaps arranged in a simple but inviting way. The soft scents of lavender and rosemary floated in the air, and something about the scene made him stop. Without realizing who was behind the counter, George approached and took a bar of soap in his hands. "These soaps are amazing. Do you make them yourself?" he asked, interested, as if looking for a connection he hadn't felt for a long time. The woman on the other side of the counter looked up and smiled. "Yes, I make them all by hand. Every detail is important to me." George watched the woman more closely, noticing the softness in her voice and the passion with which she spoke about her products. Her face looked vaguely familiar, but he couldn't pinpoint where. Still, something about her touched him in an unexpected way. "You put a lot of effort into this, don't you?" he asked, not knowing why the conversation intrigued him so much. "More than you think," Margaret replied, without realizing that she was talking to the man who had changed her life months ago. George continued to visit the local market over the next few weekends. Something about the simple atmosphere drew him back, a feeling he couldn't explain, but above all, he found himself thinking about the soap woman. Her dedication, the simplicity with which she talked about her work, and the sparkle in her eyes when she explained each fragrance. That woman had planted a seed of curiosity in his heart. One Saturday, George returned to the soap stall, where Margaret was once again organizing her merchandise. She smiled when she saw him approaching. "You're back," she said in surprise. "Looks like my soaps were a hit." George laughed, something rare in his life these days. "They're amazing. I need more, actually. I think I'm addicted to the lavender one." Margaret smiled as she picked up another lavender bar for him. "This is one of my favorites, too. It's calming, don't you think?" George agreed, looking around. "Have you always worked with this?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, but then answered, "Not really. I worked for almost 30 years in a supermarket chain. It was a good job, until it wasn't anymore." George was puzzled. "What happened?" She sighed, but her face maintained a serene expression. "The company decided I wasn't fast enough to keep up. I was fired, but it was the best thing that could have happened to me." George, surprised by the answer, frowned. "Best thing? It can't have been easy." Margaret shook her head. "It wasn't, but it forced me to go back to my roots, to something I loved and which had been dormant in me. I started making these soaps to deal with the pain, and suddenly I realized that I could turn it into something bigger." George was silent for a moment. That story had touched him in an unexpected way. He thought about how many people like Margaret he had fired over the years, without ever stopping to think about the real impact. In his mind, they were just numbers. He never imagined that cold decisions could transform lives in this way. "It's admirable what you've done," he said at last. "Not everyone can reinvent themselves after something like that." Margaret smiled again, but this time there was a certain sadness in her gaze. "I didn't have much choice. Either I found something to give me strength or I stayed stagnant. And to be honest, I never expected it to work out so well. At first, it was just to occupy my mind." George looked at the soaps on the counter, each carefully packaged, and saw Margaret's resilience in every detail. The man who once saw the world only through financial results now saw something different. There, in the simplicity of those stalls, was an invisible force that he had never noticed in the corporate environment. "You've turned your pain into something beautiful," he said, almost without realizing he was speaking aloud. Margaret nodded, her eyes shining. "Life sometimes pushes us down paths we don't expect, doesn't it?" George found himself reflecting on his own pain. The accident, the loneliness that came with it, the detachment from his work. For the first time in a long time, he felt he could understand some of what Margaret had been through. The universe seemed to be trying to teach her something. Perhaps it wasn't all about immediate results, but about the connections she made along the way. "Have you thought about expanding this?" asked George without much pretension. "I mean, your soaps, they have the potential to reach more people." Margaret laughed softly. "Sometimes I think about it, but I never imagined it could be so big. I do everything myself, you know? I don't know if I could keep control of something bigger." George, who had always been involved in big business, felt a twinge of excitement when he heard this. His entrepreneurial instinct couldn't be ignored, and he saw here an opportunity not only to help, but also to be part of something new. "I think you're underestimating the power of what you have in your hands," said George with a smile. "With the right strategy, this could become much more than a stall at a local fair." Margaret looked at him, surprised by the seriousness in his words. "Do you really think so?" "Absolutely. You have an incredible product, and with a story like yours behind it, people love overcoming stories." Margaret was silent for a moment, pensive. She had never really considered expanding her business, not in such an ambitious way. Everything she did was for passion, but the idea of reaching more people with her products intrigued her. "I don't know. It seems like a distant dream," she admitted, fiddling with the packaging on the table. George stepped forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "If you want, I can help you turn that dream into reality. I have experience in business, and I can guide you with whatever you need. But of course, the decision is yours." Margaret looked at him, surprised and hesitant. It was hard to believe that someone like him was offering help, and she still didn't know enough about George to trust him completely. But there was something in the way he spoke, a sincerity that touched her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, looking straight into his eyes, as if trying to understand his true intentions. George hesitated for a moment. He himself wasn't sure why he was so involved. Perhaps it was his way of making up for the impersonal decisions he had made over the years. Or perhaps it was the need to find a greater purpose, something he hadn't been able to achieve in the corporate world. "Because I believe in you, Margaret. I believe in your story, and I think the world needs to know it." Margaret remained silent, processing his words. She didn't know what to say at that moment, but something inside her told her that that meeting, that conversation, was a turning point. In the days that followed his meeting with Margaret, George couldn't get their conversation out of his head. There was something about that woman, her resilience and determination, that made him reflect on his own decisions. He was no longer the man who judged people's worth only by the numbers they produced. There was a new perspective emerging, and it bothered him in a way he had never felt before. Lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, George went over in his mind the details of his conversation with Margaret. Her story of dismissal struck him in a strange way. He knew that he had fired countless people over the years, always with the justification that it was just business. But now, with this new insight, he began to wonder about the impact of his decisions, how they shaped people's lives. It was then, during a chance meeting with former colleagues, that he discovered something that shook him to the core. "You won't believe this, George," said one of his colleagues, smiling as they sat down for coffee. "Remember that woman you fired a few months ago? Margaret, I think, was her name." George raised an eyebrow. "Margaret?" "Yes, her. Worked for the company for years. I hear she's selling handmade soaps now. At one of those local fairs. Who'd have thought it, eh? A fresh start." George froze. He blinked a few times, trying to digest the information. Handmade soaps? He could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Yes," continued his colleague. "Curious, isn't it? I saw her the other day. I never thought she'd manage like that after being fired. I imagined she was better off outside the company than inside." George didn't answer. His hands began to sweat as the weight of the revelation fell on him like an avalanche. Margaret, the woman he had helped without knowing who she was the same person he had fired months before. And now she had been reborn from a decision he had made without a shred of remorse. Guilt overwhelmed him. He remembered how Margaret had seemed genuinely grateful for the help he had offered, unaware that the man in front of her was responsible for her initial suffering. The irony of the situation hit him hard. George felt a twinge in his stomach, as if an invisible hand was squeezing him from the inside. "I have to go," said George abruptly, getting up from the table before his colleague could reply. He left the cafe and got into his car, his heart racing and his mind in turmoil. That night, as he stared at the ceiling in his bed, the image of Margaret and her words echoed in his mind. He thought about how his dismissal had pushed her onto a path that, although difficult, had led her to rediscover her passion. But he also knew that, at the time, he hadn't thought twice before dismissing her. And now, everything seemed clearer than ever. His decisions, so coldly calculated, had the power to transform lives, for better or worse. "How could I have been so blind?" muttered George, guilt eating away at his conscience. He knew he had to put right what he had done, even if he couldn't go back in time. It was as if life was giving him an opportunity for redemption, and he couldn't ignore it. The next morning, George decided that he would go back to the fair and look for Margaret. This time, he knew who she was. This time, he was prepared to do the right thing. When he arrived at the fair, his heart was pounding. He walked quickly between the stalls until he found Margaret's stand. She was organizing her products, as always, with the same dedication that he admired. Seeing him approach, Margaret smiled, not imagining what was to come. "Good to see you again, George," she said with a warm smile. "Back for more soap?" But George swallowed, feeling the weight of the truth in his throat. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." Margaret frowned, not understanding. "What is it? Did something happen?" He took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation wasn't going to be easy. "I know that you worked for many years in a supermarket chain, and that you were fired." Margaret nodded, not knowing what he was getting at. "Yes, but why are you asking me this now?" George stared at her, his voice trembling as he continued. "Margaret, I'm the one who fired you." Margaret's eyes widened and the smile disappeared from her face. She remained silent, processing the information. "You... what?" "I own the supermarket chain where you worked," said George, guilt evident in his voice. "I made the decision to fire you, And now, seeing what you've done with your life, seeing your strength, I feel awful. I didn't know the impact it would have on you. And the worst thing is that I didn't even think twice about it. Margaret remained silent for a few moments, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at the soaps in front of her, trying to absorb what she had just heard. That man, who had helped her so much over the last few months, was the same one who had thrown her life into chaos. George continued, I can't go back and undo what happened, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. And if you let me, I'd like to help your business grow. Not out of guilt, but because I believe in what you're doing. Margaret looked at him, her eyes still full of surprise, but also of understanding. The anger that might have arisen was curiously not there. She had found peace in her new life, and perhaps, in a way, that moment of pain was the push she needed. You changed my life in ways I could never have imagined, Margaret said at last. At first, I hated you, but now I see that it led me to rediscover something I loved. Maybe it was fate. George, relieved by her reaction, smiled shyly. Maybe, but I still want to make things right this time. Margaret sighed, looking at her soap suds and then at George. Well, if you really want to help, we can talk about expanding the business, but know that this is more than just a project for me. I know, said George, and that's why I want to be a part of it. Not just to correct my mistakes, but because I see what you've built, and I think it's something the world needs to know. Margaret nodded, a slight smile appearing at the corner of her lips. Then let's see where it takes us. George returned to the fair the following weekend, determined to help Margaret in any way he could. He didn't have a detailed plan, but he knew he wanted to make up in some way for the impact his decision had made on her life. When he arrived at the stall, Margaret was organizing her products as usual. When she saw him, she smiled, but there was a mixture of curiosity and suspicion in her gaze. George, you're back, she said as she tidied up the last of the packages. I was hoping you'd come. So, how do we get started with this idea of expanding my business? George, still a little nervous, approached the table, looking at the meticulously organized soaps. The first thing we need to do is increase your production. I've been thinking about how we can do this without losing the artisanal quality. I know you do everything yourself, but with a little help, we could double or even triple the quantity. Margaret looked at him, crossing her arms. More production means more work, George, and I'm not sure I'm ready to lose control over something that's so personal to me. George nodded, understanding her hesitation. I understand, which is why I'm proposing something gradual. We can start slowly with a small, trusted team that learns your techniques. You'd still be in control of everything, but you wouldn't be overburdened. We can keep the artisanal essence, which is what makes your product special. Margaret sighed thoughtfully. I confess it's scary. I never thought of expanding like this. I started it to survive, and now it seems to be turning into something much bigger. George smiled, encouraging her. And that's good, Margaret. You have something unique here. People love your products, but what will really attract the public is your story. The way you've transformed your life is inspiring. That's what people will buy more than the soap. Margaret reflected on George's words. She knew he was right, but there was a fear in giving up something that had become so personal. On the other hand, she had never imagined that someone would believe in her vision so much that they would want to invest in it. If I accept this, will you promise not to turn my business into something impersonal? Asked Margaret with a serious expression. I don't want it to become another mass production. Like those big brands, I want people to know that each soap was made with care, with love. George nodded, looking her in the eye. I promise, Margaret, I'm here to help you grow, but without losing your essence. That's what sets you apart from any other brand. And I'll make sure you have control over how everything is done. Still uncertain, Margaret looked at her products, touching one of the bars of soap as if pondering the decision of her life. All right, she said at last, let's give it a try. But if I feel it's getting away from what I believe in, I'll back off. Understood? George smiled, satisfied. Understood, and I'll be here to make sure everything goes the way you want it to. That same day, they started discussing ideas. George suggested investing in a small production space, hiring some artisans who could learn directly from Margaret, keeping the process manual and artisanal. In addition, he proposed creating a stronger visual identity for the brand, something that reflected both the products and Margaret's story. I know some designers who can help you with this. We can do something simple, But that captures the essence of what you do, said George as they walked around the fair, looking at other stalls. Your soaps have a soul. We need to show that in the marketing. Margaret, who had never thought much about design or marketing, was intrigued. Do you think that's really necessary? I've always sold well without any of that. You sell well here at the local fairs, George explained. But if you want to reach a wider audience, we need to tell your story in a way that everyone can see. And that starts with the image you project. She nodded, still processing all the changes that were about to take place. It was scary, but also exciting. I guess that makes sense, but I want to be involved in every decision. I don't want anyone to do it for me. Of course, assured George. You'll be involved every step of the way. I just want to bring you some ideas that can help you grow. Margaret smiled, relieved. I think that might work then. And if you're with me, we can give it a try. Over the next few days, George and Margaret began to put the plan into action. They found a small space where production could be expanded without compromising the quality of the soaps. Margaret taught every step of the process to the few artisans they hired, ensuring that care and attention to detail were maintained. Each soap continued to be made by hand with the same care and dedication. Meanwhile, George took care of other areas of the business. He brought in designers to help create a logo and packaging that reflected Margaret's artisanal essence. Everything was done with simplicity, elegance, and a personal touch, just as she wanted. These new packages are beautiful, Margaret said one day, looking at the samples the designers had brought. I never thought something like this could represent so much of what I do. And it's only the beginning, George replied with a smile. People will fall in love with your work in the same way I did, and we'll make sure everything is done right. Margaret looked at him, feeling grateful. Their partnership was something she had never expected, but it was working in a way she had never imagined. She was still wary, afraid of losing the essence of her work. But with George by her side, she was beginning to believe that maybe this was the right way. Thank you, George, she said sincerely. You're changing my life again, but this time for the better. George smiled, pleased. This is just the beginning, Margaret. We still have a lot to do together. George continued to visit Margaret's store regularly. The business was growing, the soaps were a success, and their partnership was looking more and more solid. The packaging was prettier, production was increasing without losing its artisanal touch, and Margaret's story was beginning to attract customers beyond the local fairs. Everything seemed to be going well. One day, while George was watching Margaret teach a new employee how to prepare one of the mixes, something caught his eye. He noticed a mark on Margaret's wrist, something that seemed strangely familiar. It was a small, oddly shaped birthmark that reminded him of something distant in his memory. Trying to push the thought away, he continued to observe, but his curiosity wouldn't leave him alone. He had always had a similar mark on his wrist, something he had been told was unique ever since he was a child. But now, seeing the same mark on Margaret's wrist, he felt a wave of confusion. Margaret, he called softly, moving closer. That mark on your wrist, has it always been like that? Margaret looked at him, a little surprised by the question. She looked at her own wrist, as if she hadn't noticed the spot for a long time. Yes, ever since I was a child. My mother used to say it was a sign of luck, she laughed, lifting her wrist so he could see it better. But why do you ask? George hesitated for a moment, uncertain what that meant. He lifted his own wrist, showing Margaret his birthmark. She looked at him, surprised, and then at his wrist. The two marks were almost identical. That's strange, said Margaret, frowning. How can two people have the same mark? George felt a shiver run down his spine. I don't know. I've never met another person with that mark. I always thought it was something rare. Margaret remained silent, observing George's mark for a few seconds. A distant memory came to her mind, something she had kept for a long time but rarely brought up. She lowered her arm, somewhat hesitantly, and sighed. George, she began, her voice slightly shaky. There's something you might need to know, something about my past. George looked at her, curious and apprehensive. What is it? Margaret took a deep breath, as if trying to gather the courage to tell a story she had never shared. When I was very young, I had a child. I was in a difficult situation and I ended up giving the baby up for adoption. I've never talked about it much. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I remember that he had that mark too. George's heart raced. It was as if all the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle were starting to fit together. Margaret, do you think? Margaret nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I never knew what happened to him. I never looked for him, out of fear. But now, seeing this mark, I don't know, George. Maybe you are. Her words hung in the air, charged with emotion. George didn't know what to say. The possibility that he could be the son Margaret had given up for adoption was overwhelming. He had grown up knowing he was adopted, but had never looked deeply into his origins. And now, that woman, who had impressed him so much with her strength and resilience, could be his biological mother. Margaret, he said at last, his voice low, I think there's only one way we can be sure. Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes. Yes, a DNA test. That would be the only way. The next few days were a mixture of anxiety and hope. Margaret and George took the test, but the result would be a long time coming. In the meantime, they continued to work together, trying to maintain normality. But deep down, they both knew that, regardless of the result, their lives were already intertwined in a profound way. Finally, the day of the results arrived. George opened the envelope with trembling hands, his heart pounding. He read the words on the paper, and the truth crashed over him like a wave. It's true, he said, his voice almost inaudible. Margaret, you're my mother. Margaret remained silent for a few seconds, as if absorbing the information. Then, without saying a word, she walked over to George and hugged him, the tears finally streaming down her face. My son, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I thought I'd never see you again. And here we are. George held her tightly, feeling a connection he had never experienced before. It was as if all the emptiness he had carried around for years was finally being filled. The woman he had helped to rediscover his passion was now revealing herself as the person he never knew he was looking for. I don't know what to say, George murmured, his voice breaking. It changes everything. Margaret, still hugging him, smiled through her tears. It changes nothing, and at the same time it changes everything. We were already family, George, even if we didn't know it. The reunion between the two brought a new layer of meaning to the partnership they were building. Now, as well as being business partners, they were mother and son, united by a history that had been interrupted in the past, but was now being rebuilt. In the days that followed, Margaret and George focused not only on making the business grow, but on building the relationship they had lost for so many years. They knew that time could not be recovered, but they had a new opportunity to walk together. George, who had spent so long focused on success and profits, now saw life differently. He had found something far more valuable than any material wealth, a family he never knew he had. Now that I know you're my mother, said George one day as they organized the store together, everything we do here has a new meaning for me. Margaret smiled, straightening the shelves. I feel it too, and I have the feeling that we're going to build something even bigger together. George looked at her, a smile on his face. Yes, we're going to turn this store into something everyone can be proud of, not just as a business, but as proof that life always finds a way to surprise us. Margaret nodded, her heart light. We're a real family now, George, and nothing is more valuable than that. Margaret and George, now united not just as business partners, but as mother and son, began working with renewed purpose. The soap store, which had previously been just a small artisan enterprise, now had an even deeper meaning. For both of them, it was more than a source of income. It was a symbol of rebuilding, redemption, and reunion. One morning, as they prepared the stock for the day, George looked at Margaret with a pensive expression. I've been thinking, he said, straightening some boxes. Now that we know who we are to each other, I think we should tell this story to the world. I think it might inspire more people than we realize. Margaret, surprised, looked up from her work. Do you think anyone would really care about that? It's such a personal story. George smiled, shaking his head. Margaret, this story is exactly what people need to hear. It's not just about business. It's about second chances, about reconciliation, and about the power of fate. You managed to transform your life after everything you've been through. And now, here we are, united in a way that no one could have predicted. Margaret was silent for a moment, reflecting on his words. There was truth in them, and although she was a more private person, there was something appealing about the idea of sharing her journey with others. I don't know, George. she said hesitantly. "I've never been much for exposing myself like that, but if you think it might help other people, maybe I should think about it." George nodded with a glint of excitement in his eyes. "We don't need to do anything big right away. We can start small, maybe with a website or a local campaign, telling the story of how we started. I'm sure a lot of people will connect with that." Margaret sighed, but there was a slight smile on her face. "You always think big, don't you?" George laughed. "It's what I know how to do, Mom." The word mother still sounded new, but each time George said it, it felt more natural, more comfortable. And each time, Margaret's heart filled with emotion. After so many years of not knowing her son's whereabouts, she now had the chance to build something new with him. The following week, they started working on the campaign. George, with his business experience, knew exactly how to structure the story. He brought in photographers and designers, and together they created a website that not only highlighted Margaret's products, but also told the story behind them. Margaret's Soap, A Story of Resilience and Love, was the title of the homepage, with photos of Margaret in her kitchen, mixing ingredients by hand, and George by her side, helping to organize the products. "I never imagined I'd see myself on a website like this," commented Margaret, looking at the photos. "It seems surreal." "It's because you deserve to be recognized," said George, as he adjusted the last details on the site. "People don't just buy soap, they buy stories. And your story is powerful." With the launch of the website and the campaign underway, sales began to grow even more. People not only bought the soaps, but sent messages of support, saying how much Margaret's story had touched them. "I got an email from a woman in Texas," said Margaret one day while reading the feedback. "She said she lost her job earlier this year and that my story inspired her to start her own sewing business. She said that if I could get back on my feet, so can she." George smiled, pleased. "That's exactly what I knew would happen. Your story has the power to change lives, Margaret, and we're just getting started." As the months passed, the soap store prospered in a way that Margaret had never imagined. The small space where she made her products was enlarged, and they now had a team of artisans, all trained by Margaret, who ensured that each soap was made with the same care and dedication as always. George, for his part, immersed himself completely in the business. He abandoned his life as a cold and distant businessman, realizing that the happiness he felt at his mother's side and building something together was far greater than any financial success he had ever achieved. One day, as they were closing the store, Margaret looked around, observing the products carefully organized on the shelves and the staff working happily. "I never imagined I'd get here. If you told me a few years ago that I'd be running a successful store alongside my son, I'd have laughed." George, who was helping to close the curtains, approached her. "You made it happen, Margaret. I just helped show the way, and now we're building something that goes beyond any dream." Margaret sighed, moved. "I don't know if I could have done it without you, George." He shook his head. "You would have, I'm sure of it. But now we're in this together, and we're going to turn this little store into something even bigger." She smiled, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Yes, we will. And the most important thing is that no matter how much we grow, we'll never lose what really matters." George nodded, looking at his mother fondly. "We're building much more than a store, Mom. We're building a new life, together." Margaret held his hand and smiled. "And nothing, absolutely nothing, can be more valuable than that." Margaret and George, after months of hard work, had transformed the small handmade soap store into a thriving chain, with branches in several cities. The business continued to grow, but the essence of what they had built together remained intact. Each product was still made with the same care, maintaining the authenticity that had made them unique. Margaret's story of overcoming obstacles and reuniting with George inspired people all over the country. That morning, Margaret was in the original store, the one she had started on her own, while George was busy with a business meeting about opening a new branch. Movement was constant, and she watched customers coming in and out, many commenting on how much they loved her products. Every compliment made her heart fill with pride. While organizing some shelves, Margaret was surprised by a customer who seemed particularly interested in chatting. "You're Margaret, aren't you?" asked a woman with a warm smile. "I read your story on the website. It's really inspiring." Margaret smiled, a little shy but grateful for the kindness. "Yes, it's me. I'm glad you liked it." The woman held a bar of soap between her hands, admiring the scent. "I lost my job recently too. I didn't know what to do, but your story gave me the strength to try something new. I started making handmade candles, and now I'm thinking of opening a little shop in the local market. I wanted to thank you for that." Margaret was touched. "I'm very touched to hear that. I know how hard it can be, but I'm happy to know that my story has helped in some way." The woman smiled again, thanked her, and went on her way. This reaffirmed for Margaret the true value of what they were building. It wasn't just a successful business, but a source of inspiration for others. Sometime later, George arrived at the store looking more relaxed than usual. He was pleased with the progress of the meeting and eager to share the news with his mother. "Mom," he began with a smile on his face, "I think we did it. The new branch is opening next month. Things are happening faster than I imagined." Margaret smiled proudly at him. "You've done an incredible job, George. But you know, what I'm most proud of is seeing the transformation in you. I've seen you change so much since we started this together." George nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "You've helped me see what really matters. I spent so much time focusing only on financial success, on numbers, that I forgot to look at the human side of things. Working with you has made me understand that what we've built here isn't just a business. It's a new life, a new opportunity to do something that really matters." Margaret put her hand on his shoulder, smiling. "And that's what makes me happy. Not the growth of the network, but knowing that at the end of the day, we've really found each other. Money and success are nice, but nothing compares to the fact that we're now a family." George looked at his mother, overcome with emotion. "I never thought I'd say this, but being here with you, building this together, has made me realize that true value isn't in how much money we can make. It's in the connections, in what we leave for others. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." Margaret hugged him tightly, feeling a peace she had never experienced before. "You know, George, I spent so many years thinking I'd lost you forever. And now that we're here, I feel that nothing could be more valuable than what we have today." George, still hugging her, murmured, "I feel that way too. I thought I was a fulfilled man, but I didn't realize how empty I was until I met you again." After that emotional moment, they went back to work. The day went on like any other, but they both knew that something much bigger was happening there. It wasn't just about opening more branches or increasing sales. It was about the journey they were on together, and the certainty that they were building something that would remain even after the last sale of the day. As they closed up store that evening, Margaret looked around, taking a deep breath. The store was quiet and the smell of soap filled the air. She felt a deep gratitude for everything that had happened, from the moments of pain and uncertainty to the days of glory and success. "I never imagined we'd end up here, George," she said with a quiet smile. "But I'm so grateful for everything, for the second chance, for you, for everything we've built." George Allen, as he locked the door, looked at his mother, feeling the same gratitude. "Me too, Mom, and I think this is just the beginning." Margaret nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes, it's the beginning of something none of us expected. And whatever comes next, I know we'll face it together. Because now we're more than business partners. We're a real family." And so as they walked down the sidewalk together, away from the hustle and bustle of the corporate world and closer than ever, Margaret and George knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. In the end, what they had built went far beyond a soap store. It was a new life, a new story, a story of reconciliation, love, and the certainty that whatever the challenges, together they could build something far more valuable than any fortune, a true family. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories like this one, we have prepared the next video just for you. Click here to watch.